In this video, we are going to be going over Chapter 8, the Lower Invertebrates. Here's some key concepts that we will basically be discussing throughout the video, but you can come back later and check them out. So we are shifting gears from things that like photosynthesize, or in earlier videos, we talked about different things in the ocean and how the water moves, currents, things like that. But now we're finally shifting over to animals in the ocean. And animals are defined as things that are multicellular. They have true cells and they don't have cell walls on their cells. They can't make their own food, so they rely on eating other things. You can have both invertebrates or vertebrates, meaning they do or don't have a backbone. Although most marine animals are actually invertebrates. Now, I know you're thinking, but a ton have a backbone. Yeah, but those tend to be the most iconic ones. But like what you see here are some sponges and things in the background that are all invertebrates. So if you added up how many invertebrates there are, there's actually a lot more invertebrates than vertebrates. So the first one that we're going to be talking about are the sponges. The sponges are in the phylum Porifera, and it's thought that long ago they were probably one of the first original animals to come about. They are asymmetrical, meaning they just kind of free form grow in different directions. They're sessile and immobile, meaning they don't move. Here's a good video by Deep Marine Scenes, Facts on Sponges, for you to check out and see some good images and explanations of how they work. But basically, inside of a sponge, they don't have any specialized tissue areas, but they do have specialized cells. So we're going to explain some of those cells here. So they have a cell called the collar cell, and the collar cell has a flagella on it that beats and helps the sponge circulate water. So in this diagram, the water's coming in the sponge and the flagella help push the water along and move it out through the osculum at the top. So this brings in food and oxygen. It also helps get rid of waste. So there's a few different body forms that you see in sponges. One is called asconoid, which is pretty basic. The cycanoid, which is more feathery, and then very complex looking is the leuconoid. With each of these, if you look at the blue arrows, this represents the direction that water flows into the organism. And again, out through the osculum, you can see some, like on the leuconoid, have multiple exit points. And then the choanocytes are shown in black. Those are going to be areas that have the flagella that push things along. And then each of these infoldings are there because it helps move a larger volume of water, and the sponge is better able to get oxygen and food and other things that it needs. So this is a collar cell up close with the flagella and the collar on it and where it anchors to the main part of the sponge and how water circulates through a sponge out these different spaces. Here's a video by Professor Dave Explains, Phylum Porifera on sponges, where you can look at that for more information. So these are obviously suspension or filter feeders. They're obviously feeding by pushing things through. They have penocytes, which is their skin along the outside, the archaeocytes, which are like an amoeba, and it'll move through this whole space, repairing anything that's broken, which is really cool. And then, of course, they have the collar cells with the flagella that we've already talked about. So reproduction can happen a couple different ways. Asexually, it can happen by budding. Remember, budding is like making a mini-me where it just makes a tiny little version of itself that's sticking off, and it's done very intentionally. And then when it gets big enough, it will break off that little bud, and that it can grow that little clone somewhere else, right? And then another type is called fragmentation. Fragmentation is where, say there's a piece of damage where something bumps into it and a random chunk just gets broken off. it can fragment and regenerate the rest of it, or it can have sexual reproduction. Most are actually hermaphrodites, where they have the male and the female parts. They have the archaeocytes, which are cells that can turn into anything. Um, Eggs, and they make their eggs from that, and then they make sperm, no shocker, from their collar cells. So if we back up and look at their collar cells, it looks like, oh yeah, this could turn into a sperm, and it does. And that's ends up being the sperm, and then the eggs come from the archaeocytes. Interesting, once the little baby is formed, it makes a planktonic amphiblastula, and this little guy moves around, and it actually has a ring-like area on it that is sensitive to light and helps it kind of orient itself. What's interesting is the adult version doesn't have that. Just when it's in its little planktonic state is it able to do that. So sponges actually compete pretty hard with some other organisms like corals and bryozoans. We're going to talk, you know what corals are, but bryozoans we'll talk about a little bit later in the chapter. They're moss-like animals that grow in colonies and on rocks and kind of encrust on those things. So obviously sponges will want to grow on the same types of places. So they have turf wars with corals and bryozoans for that perfect spot to grow a whole little colony. So in order to get other organisms to go away, they will actually produce chemicals that can kill competitors, or they will actually bore down into corals. Interesting, for predator-prey relationships, sponges have something in them called spicules, which for us would be like eating glass or fiberglass, like these tiny, tiny little glass shards. And so almost nothing can actually eat that and digest it. But sea turtles are an example of something that can. I think that sea turtles have like gut linings like that is just made out of like hammers, nails, and anvils or something, because they can digest literally anything. So here is a picture of a hawksbill turtle eating a sponge and having no ill effects from that because of its amazing digestive system. Sponges also have symbiotic relationships. Remember that a symbiotic relationship just means that a relationship exists. It doesn't mean it's good or bad. And sometimes that term is misused in other videos or taught incorrectly. So a symbiosis just means there is a relationship. However, there are some of those relationships are defined as mutualistic, where it's good for both, or commensalism, where it's good for one and neither here nor there for the other organism. So some organisms will live inside of the canals of these sponges. So one example of that is a shrimp that ends up going inside of a sponge when it's a tiny little baby, with a male and a female go in there, and they end up growing and eating different things that come in using the sponge as protection. They'll eventually grow so big that they're locked inside of the sponge for the rest of their lives. And then their eggs and sperm will actually come out through the canals like the osculum and float away and hopefully find another sponge, because the parents are locked in the house forever. Here's a video by SciShow, The Shrimp and the Sponge, a deep sea love story, that you can see more like videos of what that looks like. It's super weird. So sponges, I also said they will go down and bore into corals like this to find a hard surface, and they'll just grow on top of the coral, which kills that chunk of the coral. So now we're going to shift to cnidarians. Cnidarians are organisms with stinging cells like jellyfish or hydroids or corals or sea anemones, and they all have cnidocytes, which are stinging cells, and they actually have nematocysts, which are spear-like stinging cells. Here's a video from Professor Dave Explains. He has a lot of videos so on this topic. So I'm pointing out, I think all of them. Eventually we get to all of them, but it's a really good, I believe, 6-part series on these. But this is Phylum Cnidaria Part 1, Intro into the Broad Characteristics, and Phylum Cnidarian Part 2, the class Hydrazoa, to check out. So, with the organization of Cnidarians, it's important to know like the body shape or what it looks like. So, they generally have a skin on the outside and a gastrodermis, which are cells that line the gastrovascular cavity on the inside, and then a mesoglia, which is a jelly part, and the majority is the mesoglia. On the inside, which is where they get their name jellyfish. But they are what is called radially symmetrical, meaning you could put this like divider down in lots of different directions and you would get an equal half on both sides. It generally looks the same on the both sides. So you can move this, orient this lots of different ways, and you're going to get equivalent halves. That's a strong theme of this chapter, is understanding that like body symmetry and how it works. So I put a video by Professor Dave Explains on body symmetry that he kind of goes over all of it in one quick video. So this is the polyp form, and this one has just the tentacles around the mouth, and this one is called the medusa form, and it's like the classic umbrella shaped jellyfish that most people think of when they think of a jellyfish. So there are stinging cells. This is crazy. So there's the stinging cells are called nematocysts, and I put a gif here of what that looks like. But the nematocysts actually like pop out with a trigger. So when this lid gets opened up, when it gets touched, there's actually a little trigger here that pushes the whole barb suddenly out, and it injects the venom, just like having a hypodermic needle. It's like an organism that has a trigger filled needle on it when it touches you. And I have been stung by jellyfish hundreds of times. I've gotten hundreds of jellyfish stings with the work that I've done before. It's not comfortable to have these. This is a video by Smarter Everyday, Jellyfish Stinging in Microscope Slow Motion. Okay, this is a really cool video. They actually got this footage from a jellyfish sting, which is really cool, and I recommend looking at it. So here's just another close-up of what the opening looks like of the lid and the trigger cell, and then this nematocyst that comes out. So you can have very dangerous stings from these. One is called the box jelly because it's very boxy, so it's not a big shocker that it's in a group called the cubozoans. But a box jelly can be fatal within 3 to 20 minutes. And this is called the Iracondi. This is a type of jellyfish that is very venomous, and it's named after some Aboriginal people in Australia, and that's one of the places where you can find it. I just have to give a shout out to this nudie here. Nudibranchs are one of my favorites, and this is one of my favorite nudies. This is a blue glaucus, or the blue sea dragon. So this is a type of nudibranch that it actually eats the Portuguese man of war and then incorporates the venom into its own body, and it's just the goat of all nudibranchs. Look at it. It's just really cool looking. So there's different types of cnidarians besides that. One is the hydrazoans, and hydra are colonial, and they actually have a joint like stomach area where they will share foods. So they have the gastrozoids that capture food, and the gonangium that serves for reproduction. So they also make a calcium skeleton, and some groups of them, most of them are sessile, but some of them will actually form these floating colonies. And in order to float, they need different members to do different things. So some of them reproduce, some catch fish, some will act as bladders and they'll blow up their cells just with air so that they can stay floating for the colony. Crazy thing is that hydra, which is a common name for hydrozoans, hydra are actually considered immortal because they can take their stem cells and regenerate stem cells. So most organisms have limited stem cells. A stem cell is a cool cell that can turn into anything you need it to turn into. So stem cells are awesome that way because they can their possibilities are unlimited for your body, right? But you only have a certain number of stem cells, but not hydra, because when their stem cells are low, they can just build more stem cells. So they're basically immortal. And then interesting, their cells don't age, whereas we have a number of things about our cells that they age over time, but hydra do not. So another Cnidarian type is a jellyfish. So I put a cool picture of a golden jellyfish that I think is really gorgeous that lives in Palau. The normal or most commonly thought of form of a jellyfish is a medusa because it can't swim really well. And you might look at this and be like, I think it swims fine, but it doesn't matter. People have decided that it can't swim very well, so jellyfish are considered planktonic. And so they are considered a plankton. They do have photoreceptors, tend to like it in the dark, and they tend to shy away from the light. Here's a video by Professor Dave Explains, Phylum Cnidaria, Part 5, Anthozoa, and here is the same, from the same series, Phylum Cnidaria, Part 4, Class Cubozoa, that will go over some of those. So a box jellyfish, we already said, is the Cubozoa. They are bell-shaped. They're compared to other jellyfish. These ones are stronger swimmers. They live in tropical spaces. They're voracious predators, especially of fish. So this is a box jelly catching a tiny little baby fish and so what it's doing to this fish here is it's injected its venom, and then that will cause the fish to have muscle spasms, which you can see here. Eventually that will cause the heart to stop, and then the jellyfish can digest the fish. So this is another video by Professor Dave Explains, Phylum Cnidaria, Part 3, that goes over a few more jellyfish. So anthozoans got their name because they look like flowers. So it's like flower animal is what its name is. And if you look at them, they kind of are flowery. So this is sea anemones, corals, and gorgonians. We're going to talk about sea anemones first. And this is obviously a coral, but this is an anemone over here. Anemones are benthic, meaning they live on the bottom of the ocean, but a lot of times you can find them in very shallow places, though they can live deep as well. They tend to be sessile, but what's crazy is they can actually move their base around and find new places to go, in many cases, if they want to. So corals are really near and dear to my heart. Lots of people have a soft spot for corals. They just love them, and we're going to spend a few minutes just talking about them here. So they are actually a type of polyp that excretes a skeleton. So if you look at these guys here in this close-up, they look a lot like a jellyfish medusa, and they just closed up in this GIF, but they'll open right back up. They look like a jellyfish, and they are a distant cousin of jellyfish. And for their life history, they were almost like jellyfish that decided, hey, we don't want to be just planktonic floating around. We want to stop and build a hard calcium carbonate skeleton and move all of our relatives around us. So when you think about a coral, you can think about a bunch of like tiny little upside down jellyfish that have like glued themselves there with calcium carbonate all over. So it really is, a lot of people look at corals and they're like, ah, it's just a rock. It's not. It's a many, it's a whole colony of small organisms living together. And if you rub up on coral and stuff and get injured by it, a lot of times it can be more painful than just getting scratched by a rock, because it does have a stinging property in many cases, just like a jellyfish. So these guys, by making these rocky skeletons for themselves, they end up actually being a reef building type of creature that helps other organisms have a space to live. So, one type of coral that people don't even know exists in many cases are the soft corals. So, soft corals do have colonies, sort of like plants. And I put two that I really like seeing in Southern California. One is called the sea pen, that when you go diving here in Southern California, you can often see these. This is, some people think Southern California doesn't have coral, but we do. And here's one of our soft corals. And then this is another coral called the sea pansy. And when you see it on the ocean floor, it looks like this. It doesn't look like much. They're not very big. Here's someone holding one of them here. But what's so cool is because they are a coral, they have some, like jellyfish relatives, have bioluminescent properties, and this is called a sea pansy that actually does have the bioluminescent properties. This is a video by Gulf Specimen Aquarium, sea pansy glow, and I highly recommend you check it out. What it shows is at night, when you go back, if you are lucky to find one of these, wherever you touch it, it will light up and glow in that space. Like wherever it is touched, you activate it. And you don't want to do it too much, because then it's a living creature, but that's what it is capable of doing. And it's really, really cool. So, for nutrition and digestion, they do have a gastrovascular tissue and cavity. Kind of gross. They're the same part for taking in food is used for waste as well. So it's like having your food come in your mouth and out of your mouth at the end, which is a little bit gross. They lots of them are suspension feeders, but of course, like jellyfish and box jellies that we just went over, are carnivorous. Sea anemones will generally feed on invertebrates and just floating things in the water. But stony corals get the majority of their food from a symbiotic relationship that they have with zooxanthellae. And just because this is so important to what is going on in our coral reefs, I need to press pause here for a minute and just take a minute to talk to you about this very, very important relationship that not that many people know the details of. So, corals, if I'm zooming in on it, it looks like a polyp. We just talked about that. And here's like a really close in picture of what a couple of coral polyps look like. And if you look at them really closely, you'll see that at least the outside fringe of these ones are kind of like clear, white, translucent-ish, right? They don't have very much color. And corals don't have much natural color or any at all. They just are clear, white, translucent-ish. And also, coral over time has lost its evolutionary ability to make enough food for itself. So, like many organisms, it takes on other organisms in a mutualistic relationship where they both can benefit. So, coral basically says, hey, I have a hard cavity that's empty. I'll take on a renter that can pay me in food. So it actually takes this organism called zooxanthellae, and zooxanthellae is actually very brightly colorful, And whatever color moves into the coral, that ends up being the color of the coral. So some coral have a relationship with like a pink zooxanthellae or orange zooxanthellae or bright pink or purple or whatever color that it is. That now, when they take in that zooxanthellae and concentrate it, that will appear to be the color of the coral is actually the zooxanthellae that lives inside of it. So zooxanthellae has the word zoo in the beginning, and zoo or zoo means animal. So it's a plankton that digests like an animal, but it actually photosynthesizes like a plant. So it goes and lives inside of the coral, and it uses the sunlight to turn that sunlight into food, and it gets plenty of food for itself, and it's actually capable of passing a lot of the food for the coral. Like I said earlier, coral can't feed itself. In fact, it's such a bad and dire situation that coral can only make about 25% of its own food, depending on the species. So it relies on this zooxanthellae for about 75% of its food. So it's kind of a lot, and it's really important that the zooxanthellae are there. Well, also, we talked about it's like an animal. So it digests, even though it's photosynthesizing, it's digesting food like an animal and creating waste. And like we talked about, that waste has to go out through the top of the coral. And the coral doesn't have a good method for getting rid of it, but it roughly can get rid of enough with the currents washing through to make it okay. Except the oceans have gotten a lot warmer. The ozone is like thinner all over, and the light coming in is more intense, and the water is warmer on these zooxanthellae. So it's causing a lot of these zooxanthellae to actually over photosynthesize and over respirate and make too much waste. So they're generating so much waste that the coral starts to get septic. And the coral is just like, you're a bad renter. You used to pay me, but now you just have waste and garbage and sewage everywhere. You need to leave. And so the coral actually expels the zooxanthellae and kicks it out. And it kicks out the zooxanthellae, and then the coral is there stuck with this sludgy waste, and it can actually be bright yellow at first when this happens from this septic like waste that's inside. Eventually that'll get washed out by currents, but now think about it, the coral does not have enough food to feed itself, plus it's just been awash with all of this septic waste, and so the coral is very sick. But additionally, the coral has also lost its color, because remember, it was the zooxanthellae that gave the coral its color. So now the coral is back to this white translucent color, and so it's said to be bleached. And so when you see a coral that it's bleached, it's very, very, very stressed because it doesn't have the right amount of food. And within about 2 weeks to a month, on only 25% food, it will die. And then also remember that during this time, there's a lot of other organisms, like tons of other organisms like algae, or like we talked about earlier, sponges, whatever, that will all want to move in and take the space of that coral. So it's not only stressed and has sepsis and it's not getting the right amount of food, but all these other organisms that have wanted to compete like for space now see it as an easy target to come in and target it. So a bleached coral can come back and can get restored if conditions get better, but it is tough. It's tough to do that because you've got about a 2-week window before the coral is so far gone that it dies. And when it dies, it will actually very rapidly, you would think the skeleton would just hold and be there and bright and beautiful and white, even though it's dead, it would still be pretty, but it doesn't. It turns into coral rubble like really rapidly. I actually have a video here that you can check out where I'm doing a swim up in Hawaii of a space that this space has some good living coral, but it also has some very dead coral. And you can see it in the video if you check it out later. Some of it is totally alive, but others spots you can see algae and things growing on it. This is a very stressed coral wall, and what I heard was that there was a really bad storm that had hit it about a year earlier. And so it's in rough shape. And at the end, you can see I just pick up some of the coral rubble where it's just totally dead, and it's a huge bummer. This is a video by Khaled bin Sultan, Living Ocean Foundation's Coral, What Do They Eat? That explains the process that I just did. But a little differently and with good images. And then here's a video by Deep Marine Scenes, Facts, Corals, and Coral Reefs. If you have to pick an order, I would say watch this one first and then watch the Khaled bin Sultan second. So I think this is the part where I go up and just kind of show you that this is all rubble. That's all just totally dead coral going all the way up that wall, and what it looks like to have that. It's just really sad and something you generally just hate to see. So, hydrozoans reproduce, because now we're going to talk about reproduction of these organisms. They have a polyp colony, and the polyps are actually their asexual stage, and they will break off the tops of these, and that will be the medusa. The medusa can have sperm or egg, and then that will get fertilized with each other. That's their sexual stage, and that fertilized egg will turn into a planular larva, which will swim around until it finds a place to settle and make a polyp. The scyphozoans, this is like a moon jelly, is pretty characteristic of the whole group. And so this is a good drawing of what moon jelly replication looks like. They also have the polyp stage, but interesting, they make this like tower of medusas, and then they will just break off a chunk of medusas, or maybe just one, but sometimes they'll release like 3 or 4 all at once. And then the medusas will float around male, female until they fertilize an egg and make the planular larva. Same thing till it settles. Here's a video by Ocean Wise, Ever Wondered How Baby Jellyfish Enter the World, that shows this planular larva. It's only like a minute long. It shows this tower of medusas breaking off, and it's just interesting. So anthozoans, remember, anthozoans are the flower-like ones, so that's anemones or corals. They have asexual reproduction where a part breaks off, but the bottom disc is still attached. So in another video, I show like an anchor that a cruise ship dropped on coral, and the anchor is dragging it along. And those corals, when you find broken up corals when you're scuba diving, you can help save them by just doing what you see here. You don't need a cage, just as long as they have that bottom disc on them, you can put it upright in an upright position, and that bottom disc can affix to a new substrate. Hopefully the substrate is like hard, not sandy, and they can start to reattach themselves. You can also have a fission where a piece breaks off, like it fragments, or you can have budding where it does grow a little mini me, and then it sloughs off and makes a new clone. You can also have sexual reproduction where male and female sperm and eggs are released in the water column until they fertilize, and then it'll form a planular larva, which will swim around and make a new little colony. Okay, So, the ecological relationship of cnidarians and the role that they play. Here's a video that shows you what I want to talk to you about next. The video by National Geographic: See a Sea Turtle Devour a Jellyfish Like Spaghetti. Going along with the theme that sea turtles have digestive systems of steel, they are crazy predators of jellyfish. So, this is, I think, a green sea turtle here eating a jellyfish, and they will just rip it apart. This is just a 1 or 2 minute video that I recommend checking out because it shows it better than it shows in this GIF. But in this GIF, you can kind of see it. The sea turtle will actually come up to the jellyfish, and because their only vulnerable part is their eyes, often they will close their eyes and then they will use their front leg to kind of push away or paddle away the jellyfish in one direction while their mouth rips it off in the other direction, and they just tear them apart like spaghetti. So it becomes an important food source that way. um Other ecological relationships of cnidarians is like our corals make very important habitats for other organisms. It's very difficult to see in this picture, but I had a lot to put on this slide. This is a sea turtle sleeping under a coral, and this is a shark swimming under, like a little reef shark swimming, sleeping under the coral. There's a large number of organisms that not only use this as their home, these fish have specific shapes to dart in and out of the coral for safety and to use it as their home. So many organisms rely on corals. It's estimated that coral only makes up a tiny fraction of the world's oceans. But when scientists have tried to estimate how many organisms at one point or another rely on coral, either for food or for safety or to raise their young and be a nursery for their young, it's something like 25% of the organisms in the ocean rely on coral at some point in their life history. And here you can see that there's certain fish that are even adapted with very tight little mouth parts because they just swim around all day pecking at the coral, eating the tiny little living polyps. So they rely on eating polyps all day. And that type of organism is called a corallivore. And just like a carnivore eats meat or an herbivore eats plants, corallivores specialize in eating coral specifically. So a large number of organisms rely on them. Then there's also a lot of symbiotic relationships. Remember, symbiotic relationships just mean that there is a relationship. It doesn't mean if it's good or bad. Here's an interesting relationship with Portuguese man of war and the Portuguese man of war fish. So the Portuguese man of war fish is a very intense little fish that happens to be 10 times more resistant to Portuguese man of war toxins than other fish. And it just swims along with the Portuguese man of war, eating its gonads like its sex organs and eating its tentacles as it moves along. And unlike anemones or like clownfish around anemones, clownfish will secrete a mucus on themselves so they're not as bothered by the stinging cells. This fish does not have that. This fish instead has lots of extra vertebrae that make it super agile, and it will actually just constantly be darting away and avoiding the um, stings of the Portuguese man of war. But if it does get stung, it actually has its own anti-venom too. So it just swims along here, eating its gonads and tentacles as it moves along. So interesting relationship. Another one is that in sponges specifically, or hermit crabs with anemones, some of them will actually put anemones on their shell and the anemones will get free food from the crab that after it nibbles on things, and the anemones give the crab protection. So that would be a good mutualistic relationship. This is a video that shows that by Blue World TV, incredible footage of a hermit crab. This hermit crab is actually changing its shell, and when it changes and goes to a larger shell, it picks off the anemones and puts it on the new shell to take it with it. Totally crazy. This is a video by Coral Reef 101 from National Geographic that you can look up as well. And then here are just a few really good videos also from Professor Dave Explains, Cnidophora comb jellies, also Professor Dave, Phylum Cnidaria Part 6 on coral reefs, and a video by National Geographic, World's Deadliest Comb Jellies. That's really interesting. So now moving away from jellies and their stinging cells are the comb jellies. These guys look like jellyfish and they would scare you like crazy with their bioluminescence, but they actually lack stinging cells altogether. They are planktonic, just floating around. They're nearly transparent. They have a statocyst bubble inside of them that helps orient them like up, down, and helps them figure out how to move or where to go. For digestion and nutrition, they tend to eat plankton, larva fish eggs. They have something called a coloblast, which is a sticky adhesive cell that they use to capture their prey. And here's a video by Alvaro Migado, swallowed whole a comb jelly preying on another comb jelly. So you can actually see the comb jelly eat another one, and then slowly how it's digested into little bits because it's transparent so you can see right through it. For reproduction, they are mostly hermaphroditic, where they have male and female parts, and those eventually will find each other and grow into a full adult. Here's a deep marine scenes facts, the comb jelly, Ctenophora, where it talks about that a little bit more. Okay, so with bilateral symmetry, since we talked about body plans and how we covered radial symmetry, this is called bilateral symmetry. So bilateral symmetry, you can't just cut it in every direction and have equal parts. There's one distinct way that this can be cut into two. And usually organisms that have this tend to have a concentrated region that you would end up calling the head of the organism. So the first bilaterally symmetrical animal we're going to talk about is the flatworms. And there's the turbellarians and the flukes and the tapeworms, and we'll go into a little bit more detail with them here. Here's a video from Deep Marine Scenes Facts Marine Flatworms, and you can see what they look like and how they move. They're mostly on the bottom dwellers, and they live in the tiny spaces in between sand, usually as a way to eat. They have sensory receptors to detect light or chemicals or movements or maintain balance. There's also some that live inside of other organisms. So for reproduction, this is really, really crazy. They actually reproduce asexually, and they're hermaphroditic when they have sexual reproduction. Okay, this is the crazy part. Both of them have a penis and a vagina for mating with each other at the same time. Crazy. Their penis is like a sword and it has two prongs to it. So here's two in this GIF, and the GIF does not do this mating process justice, but these are two flatworms that have found each other, and they are going to fight each other and try to stab each other with their two-pronged penis. When one of them stabs the other one with their two-pronged penis, you just lost, and now you got impregnated. And then the other one will go away. The winner goes away. The loser now gets pregnant with all of the eggs and has to use their body strength and energy to go towards growing and caring for those eggs while it's in its body. So the organisms don't want to lose this battle. They don't want to be the one that got stabbed. So um while turbularians produce just a few eggs, there are parasitic flatworms that produce 10 to 100,000 times more eggs than the turbularians. And obviously, it's parasitic. That's kind of disgusting. And it just goes out there and it's hoping to make its way inside of another organism so it can grow in it. Okay, if you are interested in the mating of flatworms, here's a video by BBC Earth, Meet the Penis Fencing Flatworm, that goes into video detail of what this fencing fight joust looks like, and it's really intense. Okay, so in ecology, what is the role of flatworms? Well, they basically can cycle nutrients around and help it to change forms. It eats other things eat it. There's also on a gross side, they are parasitic. Some of them can be parasitic. And so because they're a parasite and they're living in a host like flatworms will have, or I'm sorry, sperm whales, for instance, can have a tapeworm that is 30 meters long. 30 meters long inside of them. And that obviously makes the whale a lot less fit, and it could die because of that. But then its body could be eaten by other things, and so it's cycling nutrients. Still not my favorite way to go. Okay, so there are also ribbon worms. Ribbon worms are benthic. They have external fertilization. They are carnivores that have this crazy proboscis. A proboscis is almost like a tongue that goes out and grabs food. And here's a GIF of what that looks like, but the next GIF is even better. This looks like it would be fake right here, but it's totally not. This is a ribbon worm throwing out its proboscis, which is effectively used like a web to capture prey. It's a thing of my nightmares. So they can be important in the ecosystem because they make burrows, they cycle nutrients, their abandoned burrows can serve as habitat and things like that. Okay, so we're going to switch to Lophophorates, which not that much is known on these, and we're going to go through them pretty rapidly. The first one that I want to talk about is the phoranids. Phoranids have a tube that they live in that they secrete of protein or chitin. They actually catch plankton and dead and decaying matter that is floating nearby them. Here is one form that we see in Southern California called the California horseshoe worm, and you can see why it's called the horseshoe worm. They can produce sexually or asexually, and they have a planktonic stage. This is kind of what it can look like. This is a video by Alvaro Migado, the horseshoe worm Foranida, that you can check out. And then we're going to talk about bryozoans. So these, earlier in this video, I said they compete with sponges for space, and that's because they live on colonies, rocks, shells, algae, mangrove. They can sometimes, they are very, very abundant and found all over the place, which it makes them important in the food chain because lots of other organisms will eat them. They're also planktonic, and most are hermaphrodites. The brachiopods are benthic. They live on the bottom. These guys have two different shells. So the top shell is a different shape than the bottom shell. So if you think of like mollusks or bivalves, you might think, oh, that's just like a mollusk or a bivalve, like a clam. But it's not, because they have two different shaped cells. They also have a fleshy stalk that they put into the sand to help them be upright. They eat dead and decaying matter and different algae. They have different sexes with a larva and a planktonic stage. and their plankton will eventually settle after like a day and be a grown up. This is a video by the Paleontology Association, Brachiopods Small but Mighty, that kind of goes into more detail on them. So as a group, these guys, Lophophorates as a whole are filter feeders, and like I said, they do feed a lot of organisms. They are somewhat disliked by ships a lot of times because they'll grow on whatever they can find, and because they're so abundant, they tend to grow on the bottoms of ships, making them kind of slimy, and they're part of what is called the fouling community, where they are not appreciated by the boating community. So that is our chapter on lower invertebrates. I hope you grew an appreciation from them. It's everything from sponges to corals, and they're such an important part of our marine ecosystem.